Hello, I'm Will Baker from the University of Southampton, where I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Englishes. I'm very pleased to have been asked by Hugh Jarvis from Kessel Academic to give this short presentation based on a paper I wrote for the ELT journal in January 2012. The paper was entitled From Cultural Awareness to Intercultural Awareness, Culture in ELT. To give you a bit of background to this paper, my research over the last few years has been interested in examining the relationship between language and culture in intercultural communication, and particularly through English as a lingua franca. And equally importantly, I've been interested in the pedagogic implications of this for English language teaching. So, to explain a bit of rationale behind the paper, cultural awareness has emerged over the last few decades as a significant part of conceptualising the cultural dimension to language teaching. So that is, L2 users and learners need to understand communication as a culturally based process and be aware of their own culturally based communicative behaviour and that of others. And cultural awareness has attempted to conceptualise the kind of knowledge, skills and attitudes involved in such communication. However, I think cultural awareness, whilst it's been extremely useful in setting a foundation for looking at the cultural dimensions of language teaching and use, has become increasingly problematic as we realise the diverse ways in which a language such as English is used on a global scale. And intercultural awareness is a proposal for an alternative way of approaching culture and intercultural communication through English. So to give you an outline about what I'm going to talk about, we're going to look at English as a global language first and how this might relate to English language teaching, and also the relationship between culture and language through English as a lingua franca, and again how this might relate to English language teaching. I'll give a very brief overview of cultural awareness as it's been presented previously, and then go on to discuss in a bit more detail intercultural awareness and how this may differ. And lastly, I'm going to look at how intercultural awareness can be applied to the language classroom. So turning to English as a global lingua franca, I think there's pretty much general agreement that English is the most widely spoken language around the globe, and also that non-native speakers of English, however they might be defined, outnumber native speakers of English. David Crystal estimates it may be at least 4 to 1. And this obviously has important implications for how we understand English and English communication and English language teaching. Not least of which is that many of the assumptions of English language teaching and other kinds of language teaching of monolingual native speakers, homogeneous national cultures and national standards of language are problematic in the face of such diverse multicultural and multilingual communication. And one way of conceiving of English used in these global contexts is English as a lingua franca, or ELF. And in particular, ELF researchers such as Jennifer Jenkins, Barbara Seidelhofer and Anna Marinin, among many others, have done much useful work here. And I'm going to use Barbara Seidelhofer's definition of English as a lingua franca. She provides a functional definition of ELF as any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice. Now, importantly, native speakers are not excluded from this definition of ELF. ELF has sometimes been accused of marginalising native speakers of English, and this is not the case with this definition. However, what should also be stressed is that native speakers do not provide the linguistic or the communicative norm for ELF communication. Although native speakers obviously use English for intercultural communication and in ELF contexts, they do not form the norm to which other participants must follow. So this also implies that for English language users, they need to have an understanding of English that goes beyond the features of one particular type of English. And that means that they need to go beyond simply syntax, lexis and phonology of, say, a standardised version of UK English or US English. Instead, they need to be prepared for a variety and diversity of Englishes and communicative practices that may be associated with that. And this suggests that the kind of knowledge, skills and attitudes of multilingual and multicultural communication and communicators is needed. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So ELF obviously has some fairly major implications for how we understand culture and language. As already noted, knowledge of a single code of lexis, grammar and phonology is not enough. It's been suggested that we need to understand the social cultural context of communication and the communicative practices that take place within that to fully understand what communication is about. However, this leads to a problem. If, as ELF research suggests, that English is associated with many different groups and many different cultures, then how can we be prepared with the kind of knowledge, skills and attitudes that are needed to engage in intercultural communication through English? Now, there are two extreme answers to this. One is that actually ELF communication is somehow culturally neutral, it's a neutral form of communication, or the other is that English communication is somehow inevitably linked to the target, a particular target culture, usually considered to be the UK or the US. Now I'm going to reject both of these points of view as being overly simplistic and not recognising the complexity of English use as a lingua franca. As World English's research and English as a lingua franca research has shown, that English is used around the world in many different ways and used to both represent and create many different cultural contexts and forms and practices. It's equally naive, I think, to claim that ELF communication can somehow be culturally neutral. No communication can be culturally neutral. All communication involves participants, none of those are culturally neutral. It also involves purposes and contexts, again none of which can be seen as culturally neutral. So we can say that ELF approaches reject a simplistic correlation between a language, a culture and a nation. So we cannot speak of English and a particular culture that it is associated with, for example the UK or the US. Rather we should speak of the cultures of English as a lingua franca. So cultures in the plural here. And culture is seen as complex, emergent and situated. And cultural frames of references are perceived of and made use of in hybrid, mixed and liminal manners, and this moves between individual, local, national and global orientations. So it's important here to stress that culture can mean many different things in English as a lingua franca communication. Now this is not to deny that national cultures are still there. Clearly people often identify with their national culture and this is an important part of communication. But national cultures are just one of many different cultural groupings that may be used. And it's equally important to recognise the fluidity of communication. So this leads us to another important question. How are such multifarious communicative practices undertaken? How do people cope with the complexity of ELF communication? Now it's been suggested that actually one of the key aspects of English as a lingua franca communication is not so much the language that's used, but rather the communicative strategies that the users employ. And as I suggested earlier, there's kind of strategies and the kind of knowledge that multilingual and multicultural communicators make use of may well be helpful here. These include things such as accommodation, code switching, negotiation, cooperation and linguistic and cultural awareness. So focusing on cultural awareness can be seen as part of an understanding of intercultural competence. So this has been a large area of research within intercultural communication research, and as related to language teaching, particularly through the work of people like Michael Byram and colleagues such as Manuel Guilherme and Karen Reisinger. They've developed a notion of intercultural communicative competence, or various other terms that are related to this, which attempts to explicate how culture and language are related in language teaching and how it can be brought into language teaching pedagogy. And I think this has been very useful in understanding the relative nature of cultural norms and in emphasising the kind of skills such as comparisons and mediation and negotiation needed for successful intercultural communication. A key part of intercultural communicative competence has been critical cultural awareness. And Michael Byram defines this as an ability to evaluate critically and on the basis of explicit criteria, perspectives, practices and products in one's own and others' cultures and countries. Now, as I said, I think this has been very useful in setting some of the groundwork, but I do think it's problematic for English as a lingua franca communication for a number of reasons. Firstly, it tends to make use of a fixed notion of cultures as related to particular nations and languages, however complex that it might be. So whilst culture is seen as having as multi-voiced and having many different opinions on it, it's still considered as bounded by nations. So we can talk of English culture associated with the UK, or English culture associated with the US, French culture in France, etc. And where English has been dealt with, as I've said, it tends to be associated with the inner circle native-speaking countries such as the UK or the US. Even when English is not discussed, there's still often a clear distinction made between native and foreign cultures. Now, for English as a lingua franca, this is problematic because it's not obvious who native speakers of ELF are, and it's even less obvious which cultures would be considered foreign. Where national cultures are transcended, for example in the work of Karen Reisinger, there are still considered to be target communities which learners should be aiming to emulate in some way. Now again, for English as a lingua franca, it's not clear what the target communities might be. And in many cases, ELF research has been either ignored or rejected in previous conceptions of cultural awareness and intercultural communicative competence. So this brings me on to intercultural awareness, which should be seen as an attempt to build on previous research and previous understandings of cultural awareness, but apply it directly to English use as a lingua franca. So I've defined intercultural awareness as a conscious understanding of the role culturally based forms, practices and frames of reference can have in intercultural communication, and an ability to put these conceptions into practice in a flexible and context-specific manner in communication. And I'll explain in a little more detail what I mean by this. So I found it useful to identify 12 elements of intercultural awareness, and those 12 elements can be grouped into 3 different levels, moving from basic cultural awareness through to cultural awareness and finally to intercultural awareness. Now I should stress that these divisions are more conceptual than they are empirical, so I'm not suggesting that users or learners of English necessarily carry in their heads 12 separate conceptions like this. And neither am I suggesting that the levels here are necessarily the way learners will learn more about intercultural communication and cultural processes. Neither am I suggesting that learners necessarily begin at level 1 and then move through steadily to level 3. But I do think it's helpful to look at the levels in terms of the complexity of understanding of culture and communication. So beginning with level 1, basic cultural awareness, this involves an awareness of culture's shared set of behaviours, beliefs and values, and the role that this plays in communication and interpretation of meaning. And it should involve an understanding of this, and also an ability to be able to articulate our own culturally based perspectives, behaviours and values. And also an awareness that others may have different culturally based perspectives and values and communicative behaviours, and some ability to compare this in some way. Now level 2 is advanced cultural awareness, and this is where I think most cultural awareness and critical cultural awareness research has previously focused on. And this is a more complex understanding of cultures. So it's an awareness of the relative nature of cultural norms, an awareness of cultural understanding as being provisional and open to revision, so this is moving beyond basic stereotypes, an awareness of multiple voices or perspectives within any one cultural grouping, and an awareness that individuals can be members of many social groupings, including cultural ones, so that people are members of national cultures, but they may also have religious groupings to which they're affiliated with, ethnic groupings, professional groupings, other kinds of social groupings as well. And also this level involves an awareness of common ground between specific cultures and possibilities for mismatch as well in communication and the effects this can have on communication. So at this level we have a much more complex understanding of culture, but it's still bounded within particular national conceptions of culture and associates a language with a particular culture and comparing languages and cultures in this way. So the final level, intercultural awareness, this is the level that I think most clearly addresses the kind of communication that's been observed in English as a lingua franca communication. Now this involves an awareness of culturally based frames of reference, forms and communicative practices as being related both to specific cultures and also as emergent and hybrid in intercultural communication. So this is really a key point here, that cultures can be seen as emergent and hybrid as well. So whilst we may make use of national cultures, we may also have cultural frames of references and understandings and communicative practices that emerge from the communication that is taking place there and then. So coupled with this is the idea that there should be an awareness of initial interaction in intercultural communication as possibly based on cultural generalisations, but an ability to very quickly move beyond these. So accepting that people make use of generalisations, but also that people are skilled intercultural communicators are able to very quickly move on from generalisations. And this can be done through a capacity to negotiate and mediate between different emergent, socio-culturally grounded community practices and frames of reference, which is based on the understanding of culture and intercultural communication outlined in the previous elements of intercultural awareness. So, what does this all mean for the language classroom? Well, I'm going to spend the last few minutes discussing different ways that intercultural awareness can be utilised in language teaching and in the language classroom. It's important to point out that as I go through these different ways that that intercultural awareness might be brought into the language classroom, I'm not suggesting this as a fixed approach or a prescriptive approach in any way. Intercultural awareness is deliberately quite general in its suggestions as what culture and what kind of communication is most relevant to particular learners will depend on the context they're learning in and the reasons that they're learning English. So these 6 suggestions that I'm about to give are just that, they're suggestions, they're not prescriptives for best practice. But hopefully they'll seek to illustrate how intercultural awareness can be brought into the language classroom. So the first area that I've highlighted is exploring local cultures. So clearly any language classroom is going to be embedded in a particular context with a certain group of learners, and this can be explored through local cultures. So the learners can look at their own cultures, they can look at their own cultures on a national level, they can also look at their own cultures within the classroom, within the community in which they live in. And what I think people often very quickly discover is even in supposedly monolingual and monocultural environments, there's actually a large degree of diversity. It doesn't take very long to discover people in the classroom who either themselves speak different languages or whose parents or grandparents speak different languages, or they may have other friends or relatives who speak different languages. Again, they may find that they have different ethnic groups within the class, different religious groups, people who've immigrated from different areas. So there's usually a large degree of diversity within even the most monolingual or monocultural classrooms once it's actually begin to explore it. And this should make learners aware of the complexity of any kind of cultural or linguistic description. Okay, the next area that can be brought into the classroom is to look at the actual language learning materials themselves. Now typically this is the textbooks learners use. So they can look at the cultural representations in the textbook and take a critical approach to this. They might ask themselves, okay, which cultures are represented in the textbooks? And then consider why have those cultures been chosen? So if local cultures are represented, what aspects of local culture are represented? What aspects are not represented? How much do the learners feel that they represent their understanding of their own culture? If other cultures are represented, again, which other cultures are represented? Why have they been chosen and why have others been ignored? The next area is exploring traditional media and arts through English. So this is really looking at things such as literature, which has formed a big part of language teaching. So what kind of texts are brought into the classroom? What kind of literature is read? What can that tell you about a particular culture? And again, if these are approached critically, they can be very interesting. So they can look at which aspects of a culture are represented through this, which aspects of the literature are perhaps nothing to do with a national culture, or present alternative conceptions of a national culture to what they might be familiar with, or which other cultures are represented. The next area is exploring electronic media through English. Now clearly this is becoming more and more important. So English is the most widely used language on the internet, as we might expect, as it's the most widely used spoken language as well. And there is a huge amount of material that's easily accessible on the internet through English. And of course this is not necessarily representative of English-speaking cultures. English is used from many different countries and cultures to represent many different things. So here learners can look at many of the different ways that English can be used. The next suggestion is cultural informants. So this is really people within the language classrooms who have experience of intercultural communication or experience of living in other cultures or countries. Now this can either be the teacher, who often have maybe spent some time abroad, or certainly has experience of communicating in English with people from different countries or cultures. And their experiences can be used to reflect on some of the different processes that they went through. And again, though, this needs to be approached critically, so if a teacher gives their perspective, it should be seen as just that, their perspective, so one particular perspective on a culture. But equally, learners too may have experiences of intercultural communication or travel abroad, etc., which they can draw on and reflect on. And finally is actual instances and examples of intercultural communication. So this can either be face-to-face, so for example, if the classroom is a multicultural classroom, then of course there's lots that can be drawn on there in everyday communication. If the classroom is perhaps more monocultural, then it may be that the teacher comes from another country, so experience can be drawn on there. Even where both the teacher and the students are all from the same culture, virtual communication can be used. So for example, chat rooms, Facebook, Skype, things like that. So intercultural communication is quite easily possible through those kind of mediums. And this can be used, first of all, as examples of actual intercultural communication, and learners can do this, or do this as homework and things like that. And equally important, though, it can be used for reflection, so learners can think about their experiences of intercultural communication and what they found useful, or what they learned from these experiences, or what they found difficult. Okay, so to sum up, intercultural awareness is an attempt to extend cultural awareness to account for the dynamic and complex cultural context of English as a lingua franca communication, which is the most widespread use of English in the world. And given how widespread ELF use is, clearly this is going to be of relevance to many learners and users of English, and hence to English language teachers and teaching. And really, intercultural awareness has attempted to emphasise the need to approach cultures and communicative practices as fluid and emergent, and to go beyond the national characterisations of culture that are often apparent in ELT materials and in practices, and to look at the multilingual and multicultural settings of English language use. If you'd like to find out more about this, then please read the article and have a look at the bibliography attached to that as well. And thank you very much for listening.